Thank you, Josh. You know how grateful I am to your father of blessed memory, who was my mentor in Washington. And he was a complex man of simple principles. Foremost among them were patriotism and loyalty. I know that he would have been enormously proud to see what you have achieved and your dedication to the museum, a cause so close to his heart. Let me also thank Carol Stolberg and Cheryl Zoller and her colleagues for this splendid evening. It's one that I will not forget, and I believe that my family will not forget. I'm humbled here tonight, and this evening cuts against my grain in two distinct ways. One is simple. Perhaps the greatest public honor of my life has been my association with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and it's I who should honor the museum. And more than anyone else, I know that the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was a collective effort. So words of gratitude must go to my colleagues, most particularly and to Sheike Weinberg of blessed memory, to Martin Smith and later Ray Farr and Ralph Applebaum, who formed the core of the creative team and were ably supported by men and women of exceptional talent and more exceptional dedication. I was privileged to work with great lay leaders, men and women who gave all that they had, all that they were to this effort, and who in the process grew in stature and ability at an age when others would have been content to rest on their laurels and to collect the well-deserved dividends of life. Two survivors and their wives deserve particular tribute, the late Miles Lerman and Chris Lerman. Miles was chairman of the International Relations Committee and forged a new relationship with the countries of Eastern Europe so that we could get archives and artifacts with which to create the museum, and who is the chair of the campaign to remember marshaled the resources to create the museum. And Ben Mead and Vladka Mead of blessed memory. Ben was the leader of the survivors movement who created the atmosphere in which survivors could place their trust in the museum. He was less concerned with bricks and mortars and more with the neshama, the soul of the institution. And he charged me with being its intellectual and spiritual guardian. The survival leadership, too, could not have operated on their own, so they needed the sheer courage and knowledge of dedicated developers who made things happen. The late Albert Abramson and Harvey Bud Meyerhoff, who assumed leadership, got the building built, and the exhibition created. And you, ladies and gentlemen, who supported the museum when it was just a vision and continued to support it. Men and women such as Fred and Barbara Court of blessed memory. Fred was one of the very few survivors of Treblinka. The Gonda family, Leslie and Susan of blessed memory, Lou and Kelly. Arnold and Nita Lauber. And you've seen the Chappelles, but I want to remember not only David of blessed memory, but Nathan and Honor Fella, and the indomitable Max Webb, who always reminds me every time we meet that he was there at the beginning, and what a beginning it was. Dr. Ziggy Ziering of blessed memory and the inspirational Marilyn Ziering. Ziggy supported the museum, but more importantly, he came to the museum and he took seminars. He was willing to give, and then he came to learn. He did exemplify the Jewish value of we shall do, and we shall hear, ancient words that were echoed by his soul. I must say that I owe the museum in one even more significant way. It was due to Jill Weinberg, the head of its Chicago office, that I met and ultimately, and unfortunately all too long reluctantly, married Melissa. And thus I've been blessed not only with Melissa, who touched the core of my being, but with our children, Joshua and Mira. A story about my daughter, who's here this evening with her husband and with two precious grandchildren, Jeremy, Judah, and Hanalea, who's named after my beloved mother. Years ago, we gathered 150 pounds of Zyklon B. We got it from Poland, and the question is, what do you do with Zyklon B? We had a former staff member who called up the EPA and asked, how do you store 150 pounds of Zyklon B? Forgetting to tell them that it had been open to the public for 50 years. And you should know that 150 pounds of Zyklon B can kill 300,000 people. The museum was in turmoil. So I decided that the only way to deal with this was to get it out of the museum and out of the area. So I went one night with a colleague, we put it in the back of my van, and I put it in my garage. And I loaded skis and basketballs and toboggans on top of it. And I never told my family. Well, lo and behold, I'm reading my daughter's essays to the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago asked, would you tell us something peculiar about your background? And she wrote about growing up with Zyklon B next to her skis. Truth is that my kids, my older kids, paid a price for my involvement. They missed dinners, we had long hours, they heard discussions that were far more intense. But I'm grateful for what they are and what they've become. And my daughter in particular, who shockingly surprised me by becoming a rabbi. My late father used to remark that if you had a choice between being smart and being lucky, you were much better off being lucky, and I was lucky. I came to the President's Commission fully by accident. Yitzhak Greenberg had been kicked out of the Soviet Union on a mission to organize a 1976 conference when Jewish activists went to help Soviet Jews. And I was next in line, so I spent considerable time getting briefed and debriefed. We struck up a friendship. I'd done some work on Elie Wiesel as a religious thinker, so when Wiesel was named chairman of the President's Commission and Greenberg was named the director, and neither of them was going to move to Washington to run an operation, they needed a young person who could do the job, and they turned to me. A funny thing happened to me, who expected to spend his career in academia and scholarship alone. And the museum was lucky in an incredible way because we dealt with Eastern Europe in a moment of great decline. They had best bet their future on the Soviet Union, and we came as an American project. We came as an American project run by Jews. They might have been anti-Semitic enough to believe that Jews controlled America, and we were wise enough not to engage in extraneous debate. So we're able to receive thousands of artifacts that created the creative vocabulary with which we built the museum. You know the results of my colleagues' achievements, a museum that has received some 40 million visitors, more than 120 heads of state, has international importance in setting the agenda for Holocaust research and education, is a clarion call for action in the wake of impending genocide, an important tool for the education of generations of Americans for democracy, pluralism, mutual acceptance, tolerance, and a beacon call against anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and indifference. It has been a great privilege of my life to have been the midwife to this extraordinary accomplishment. 3.5 years after the museum opening, I was offered the opportunity by Steven Spielberg to come to LA to undertake the creative task of gathering the testimony of Holocaust survivors, 52,000 testimonies, 57 countries, 32 languages, the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, now the USC Shoah Foundation Institute, under the distinguished leadership of Stephen Smith, of Kim Simon, and my friend June Bieler is here, who offered me the opportunity. And LA became our home. We have enjoyed wonderful neighbors who are sitting over there, an extraordinary community. marvelous challenges, and a real sense of belonging. We never imagined ourselves in LA. We had so many stereotypes, but for us it's been unbelievably warm, moving, creative experience with wonderful colleagues, a vibrant sense of community, and I have a wonderful intellectual home at AJU. Just a word about me and my generation, because it may set something, and then a word about the museum. Growing up in a religiously traditional environment in the 1950s and 60s in New York, our teachers were survivors and refugees before the term was used. They never spoke of their experience, but they told us that we, the spoiled, privileged children raised on whipped cream and ice cream, had to make up for a world that was destroyed. I went to a synagogue that was comprised of German and Belgian Jews who'd escaped in 1938, 1939, and even as late as 1940. The word Holocaust was never used, but we heard words camp, death, children. Silence left an indelible impression. Years later, it became my task, perhaps my destiny in life, to translate what I had experienced in silence into an American idiom for an American audience, and my rare opportunity to do so on a national stage. Elie Wiesel said again and again, only those who were there will ever know. There's something that survivors know that we non-survivors, no matter how scholarly or learned, can never know. And it's our task as scholars and educators, and the museum's task, to listen, to mediate between their world and the world of their 21st century audiences. The museum took its place where it should be, adjacent to the National Mall at the intersection between Museum Washington, its neighbors are the Smithsonian, the Air and Space Museum, Monumental Washington, to Presidents Jefferson and Washington, Lincoln, Eisenhower, FDR, and to the great Martin Luther King, and governmental Washington within sight of the White House and Treasury, but a short distance from Capitol Hill and the power of Washington. Why? Because the museum is the most important reminder of what happens when human genius in technology and creativity, when the power of government in its many capacities are harnessed to evil and not to good, when they're detached from the most important values of our nation, equality, certain inalienable rights, checks and balances, limits on the exercise of government that protect us against the abuses of power and guard the core rights enumerated in our great Bill of Rights. The generation of survivors that is all too quickly leaving the stage of history have had many achievements. The Shoah has been transformed into the forefront of contemporary political and ethical consciousness. It's the negative absolute in a world that sees too much relativism. Museums and memorials have been created throughout the world. Holocaust remembrance is a basic part of the Jewish calendar and increasingly part of the calendar of many nations. And testimony has been gathered on an unprecedented scale in the most contemporary technologies. Memoirs have been written and will provide living voices of their witnesses far beyond their lifetimes. Their stories will form cornerstones for films and education for generations. Most Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Survivors and survivors were also victims, were only a small minority. All who survived were faced with the question, what do we do with the accident of survival? Why did I survive? Over time, they found the answer. It was how when they lived their life in the aftermath. It was how they bore witness and transmitted the legacy. For Holocaust survivors, the survival of Jewish people became paramount. The final statement of Jewish history and Jewish memory must be about life, not death, no matter how pervasive that death. Survival required empowerment. For many, the response to the destruction was the recreation of the State of Israel. But I see it in a larger context. Holocaust survivors responded to survival in the most biblical of ways possible, by remembering evil and suffering to deepen conscience, by enlarging memory and broadening responsibility. It is thus that the biblical Israelites responded to slavery and the Exodus. It is thus that the survivors responded to the Shoah. Like the biblical narrative of the Exodus, the story is particular. We were slaves in the land of Egypt, but the particular has become universal. All freedom-seeking people understand Egypt and Pharaoh, crossing the sea, the journey into the desert, the goal of the promised land. All yearn for Moses, and all understand that for miracles to occur, enslaved peoples must dare to do the miraculous. The story strengthens every human being seeking freedom. The Holocaust story is particular. Jews were singled out for total annihilation, men, women, and children. All the instrumentalities of government in the most cultured and advanced societies were brought to bear on their destruction. The evil was without bounds. It was overwhelming, and yet there were also rescuers and resistance fighters, though most were indifferent or bystanders. There were messengers who brought forth the world, who called and rallied and demanded action. There were liberators, fighting men and women who became healers. And there were the survivors who responded to death and destruction not by rage, and not by fury, and not by vengeance, but by rebuilding life. They transformed victimization into witness, dehumanization into a plea to our humanity. This is a story that will be told and must be told by all who have become victims of genocide and mass oppression. The final word is not death and destruction, but a plea to expand our sense of conscience, to deepen our commitment to our collective humanity. And if any word is needed in this broken world, hear the words. Hear the words. Expand our sense of conscience. Deepen our commitment to our collective humanity for all of us. We were not witnesses, yet we have lived in the presence of witnesses. We can become witnesses to the witnesses, taking forth from the museum what we have learned and what we have seen, and transforming it into action to a better world, to prevent genocide, to combat anti-Semitism, and to alleviate the world's suffering and help heal its victims. That responsibility is so urgently needed in our day, is ours and ours alone. Thank you.